into these very specific applications that I feel like are here. Sure. They're here. I just don't know if we're actually putting the dollars behind the funding to allow, or empowering the agencies that could use, and I'm thinking on all sorts of natural resource issues that would be so critical to us doing a better job as stewards of our lands and waters.
Ranking Member, thank you for the question. I'd start just with a general comment. There is not a part of this great country that today is not affected deeply by the commercial space industry. And so that's a wonderful thing. We see it all the time from different places. In fact, we're trying to understand better what the size and shape is of the space economy in all of the states in order to help government leaders as well as others, entrepreneurs in those states, achieve pieces of that global space economy we talked about. On the open architecture data repository, those remarks from me were confined to our responsibilities under SPD 3 on space traffic management. If you study the space debris problem, it has become a very urgent problem. Space debris essentially potentially harms anything that flies in space, starting with the space station, the economic value and scientific value of all the satellites that are up there. Because the problem is so urgent, General Hyten and the Department of Defense turned to us and said, number one, we think it's natural that the Commerce Department actually take over notification for commercial and civil entities. The way we want to approach that is to take a problem that was traditionally behind closed doors and put it into a state-of-the-art modern cloud computing capability. And what we get there, in addition to our responsibilities to warn owner-operators, we will get a place within which folks coming forward in the commercial market, in academia, will be able to experiment, to vet, to validate both sensors, new analytic tools, et cetera, and what we hope and sometimes playfully refer to as disruption of the space debris problem, because it's a very serious problem, and we need to make rapid progress in understanding it better and mitigating it.
And on the applications like NOAA, what do we need to do to better take advantage of those current technologies? So
we see there's a uniquely American phenomenon in the market here, which is the role of private capital. About the third week I was on the job, the Secretary sent me to a meeting in New York with about 50 people, which essentially represented $2 trillion of private investment in the market. And we see that as really a driving source behind the development of all new applications, resource management, decision-making of all kinds. And so some of that's going to come from within the market. The government will also have unique needs as well that it can develop those applications through.
Well, thank you. I don't know if it's living in the shadow of the Space Needle that furthered all of this, but I'm just telling you the industry, the private side of the industry is definitely alive and well. Administrator Bernstein, my time has expired, but I'm going to submit for the record a question for you about the NEOWISE program. And just as Mr. O'Connell was talking about accuracy and information, I think there's some concerns on the NEOCAM and large synoptic survey telescope. So I want to get a question for the record for you from that, and we'll follow up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Senator Cantwell. I have Senator Rosen, then Cruz, and then Peters. Senator Rosen.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here and for your testimony today. And what I'd like to do is shift a little bit and to address the issue of satellites. Like you're talking about space debris, there's a lot orbiting the Earth and the increasing role that they're going to play both militarily and commercially. So with that, that's also going to increase the vulnerabilities that got a little music there, that must be addressed. You know, in 2017, China launched 3 new satellites. I'm sure that those numbers will be increasing by them and by others. So, Administrator Bridenstine, with the rise in the international competition in space, I'm really concerned particularly about not just the data that we store, what we transmit, how we communicate with our military complex and allies and partners around the world, and what vulnerabilities that creates. So what are you doing with the satellites that connect us all to intervene in this area?
So that's an important question when you think about space-based communications. When you think about what a satellite is, Senator, it is a node in a communication network. That's all it is. So we're collecting data. It could be imagery. It could be, any part of imaging the Earth with the electromagnetic spectrum for science, discovery, those kind of things, looking into deep space. But it's just, it's data. And that data then gets transmitted. And of course, those are all, using the electromagnetic spectrum. So one of the challenges is, and we've seen this in the past, especially as it relates to NOAA, one of the challenges is we have competitors in the world that would love to, shut down our capabilities when and if they like.
Not even shut down. What about modify the data that's returned to us so we make an inaccurate, changes the outcome of an algorithm for something in our military, perhaps?
So that's, so that is definitely a concern. I will tell you what the DoD does and what NASA does, we're kind of different. We intentionally try to make sure that our data is available to the world. We give it away for free. We want to make sure that we are doing science, discovery, exploration, all of those things that are soft power things. On the DoD side, their communication networks, of course, they need to be frequency hopping for anti-jam. They need to have a lot of encryption. And of course, we have encryption too. I want to be clear. Our goals are very different than their goals. Our architectures are different. But I would say the key is cybersecurity, which we are focused on, like a laser as an agency. When I was in the House of Representatives, we had to shut down some weather satellites for a period of 3 days. And that was, of course, because we had an international actor hack into the National Weather Service, and my state of Oklahoma, for a period of 3 days, didn't get any data. Now,
it's not going to change the weather, but it can change what we do about it.
That's exactly right. So the key is, why is an international actor interested in disrupting weather prediction? Well, they're proving capabilities. They're proving technology. Right. And so if the weather enterprise is at risk, you can imagine NASA is at risk. And so we understand this critical challenge, and we're making adjustments every day to be on top of it.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
And Mr. O'Connell, we're talking about this. I'd like you to, if you could address something that the private-public partnerships or private sector, how do you think they're addressing it, and are they on top of what they need to be?
Absolutely, Senator. And again, thank you for the question. We're actively working with the industry to do two things. One, to understand the kind of threats that they are seeing to their systems, what are they experiencing in their data flows, but also to share information out in the other direction on security practices, et cetera. The office has just been invited to a National Security Council working group on space cyber integration that will deal with a lot of the issues that Administrator Bridenstine has raised.
Yeah, I see this as an easy way for bad actors to infiltrate our systems, so it's something we need to be hyper-vigilant about. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Senator Rosen. The senator from the Houston Space Center.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for your testimony, your leadership. Administrator Bridenstine, let's talk a little bit about the ISS. As you are aware, last year's budget from the administration proposed ending all federal government funding for the ISS by the year 2025. The Space Subcommittee of this committee held a series of hearings on whether that was wise, whether that was prudent. The testimony we received consistently was that it was not. The space station, as a matter of scientific and technical capability, can continue to be utilized at least until 2030, if not later. And given that the taxpayers have invested over $100 billion in it, the testimony we received is that it was prudent to get the maximum return for that investment, and that it would be nothing short of catastrophic to cede low Earth orbit to the Chinese. In light of that testimony, I introduced legislation that explicitly extended funding for the space station until 2030, This committee passed that legislation unanimously. It went on to pass the Senate unanimously. I was very pleased to see this year's President's budget that did not have that language zeroing out the funding, but instead talked about transitioning to more commercial opportunities, which all of us would like to see, but no longer suggested a threat to the funding for the space station in 2025. I think that is beneficial to the American taxpayer. I think it's also beneficial to our partners in the space station, making clear that our commitment to the station is to get the maximum reasonable life and use out of it. Do you agree with that sentiment?
Yes, sir. I have been watching your leadership on this issue with great interest, as you can imagine. And I would say we are starting even right now today to put together all of the tools so that we can commercialize low Earth orbit as rapidly as possible. It is true the language ending direct funding is not the language we're using anymore in 2025, but instead we're transitioning, and that's starting today, transitioning to new funding models that would be enabling of commercial activities. What you'll find in this budget request is $150 million specifically for commercialization activities in low Earth orbit. But that $150 million does not include the great investment that is the ISS that helps us transition. We need to utilize the ISS for the transition to commercialization. It is a tool to get to commercialization. So know this, I believe a day is coming when we will have commercial activities in low Earth orbit. The goal here, Senator, and you know this, NASA wants to be one customer of many customers in a robust commercial marketplace for human activities in low Earth orbit. At the same time, we want to have numerous providers that are competing on cost and innovation to drive down cost and increase access to space. We just recently saw what happens when we can dock a commercial Crew Dragon to the International Space Station with a reusable rocket provided by the private sector. Costs are going to go down, access is going to increase. We don't want to just do it with commercial resupply to the International Space Station, not just with commercial crew to the International Space Station, but actually with habitation in low Earth orbit. The purpose for this ultimately is so we can save resources and use the precious dollars that this committee and the Senate and the House give us, use those precious dollars to go to the moon, where there is not yet a commercial marketplace, but for which we believe there will be a commercial marketplace. Our goal is to retire risk, commercialize, and go further and do more. And I do believe the date very well could be 2025. And that's my goal. And I'm going to be very clear. My goal is to move us to a day where in 2025 we are completely commercialized. But it's important to note that what we're talking about now is the development of a new funding model.
Well, and I want to commend the administration for listening to Congress, that we have long had bipartisan agreement that we will continue America's leadership in space, and listening to Congress is an important part of maintaining that consensus. Another avenue to potentially ensure that we have the funding both for the ISS and for exploration is having our partners and allies pay their fair share. Can you give your thoughts in terms of how much does the United States currently contribute to the fund to operate the ISS, and how does that compare to the contributions of our international partners?
Yes, sir. So right now, when you think about the International Space Station, the United States of America is a partner at about well, I'm talking about the United States segment of the International Space Station. There's the U.S. segment, and then there's the Russian segment. The United States segment, we have international partners on there. Japan, the European Space Agency, Canada. And of course, the European Space Agency includes 11 different nations right there. So on that partnership, the United States of America contributes about 77%. The balance is provided by the rest of those partners. The highest, I think, is around 10% and then 8%, and Canada is around 3%. I don't want to suggest that this is a bad deal, because what we get for our commitment, there's rights and responsibilities. Our responsibility is at the 77% level. Our rights are at the 77% level. That includes astronauts. It includes experiments on the ISS. So while we are paying a bigger percentage, we are also receiving a bigger benefit from it. That being said, for the future, When we think about the entire architecture between low Earth orbit and the Moon and eventually Mars, we have to change that paradigm. If the United States of America is going to be a 77% contributor, that, in my view, is not the right approach, and it won't be sustainable. My charge is to create the sustainable return to the Moon, which means we need more partnership from more nations. At the same time, we need to take our partners that we currently have and have them increase funding as well, as the United States of America already has done and will continue to do with your leadership, of course.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Administrator, if China were looking for partners in an international space station, they might be willing to kick in 87%, might they?
I would argue that they might be willing to kick in 100% in order to have the influence. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Be a pretty unreliable partner, but to some countries out there, it might seem tempting.
In fact, sir, it is already happening. Our European partners right now, there are Europeans in China training to become taikonauts for the upcoming, Chinese space station. So China is moving very rapidly to entice the world to join them in their efforts in low Earth orbit.
Well, I want to thank Senator Cruz for his leadership in this regard. Senator Peters and then Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Senator Cruz as well for the leadership on the space station. I'm a backer of it as well, working with Senator Cornyn on legislation with you to make sure that we keep the station operating to 2030. We've made a substantial investment in that station. It's critical to maintain our partnership, all the things that we've heard. But what I hear from you, Administrator, is that you have set a goal and believe that it's possible that commercial activities will be able to pick up that cost by 2025, which certainly seems very ambitious. And so my question is for Mr. O'Connell, do you believe the commercial space industry would actually start picking that all up in 2025? Is that is that realistic, or should we be thinking about something else?
Senator, thank you. We are seeing a number of industry partners come forward, partly to understand the roles that they can play on the space station, the extent to which they can access it. So far, we're seeing relatively small applications for the space station, but we're hoping to encourage others for larger applications as well. We also see companies coming in the market that believe they can create a wholly commercial space station as well, but the transition period is going to be critical.
And 5 or 6 years is ambitious, to say the least?
It would be ambitious.
Yeah. The other question for you, Mr. Khan, you've talked about orbital debris and as a critical problem that I know Mr. Bridenstine believes as well. NASA is very concerned about, the Department of Defense pretty much across agencies. And as we get more constellations of satellites, it's going to be a bigger and bigger problem, probably growing exponentially in the years ahead. You talked about some of the efforts being made at the Department of Commerce to track this. I know there's a debate going on among agencies as to who should be in charge. And I think whenever you have a big problem, you got to have somebody who's actually in charge. You can't have everybody pointing fingers at each other. And it's a complex web from the Department of Transportation, FAA, Commerce, DOD. Who do you, now I know where you work, but give me the argument as to why Commerce is best to do this job, and why not the Department of Transportation and the FAA, which has quite a history of tracking objects in the air?
So let me focus on what we've been doing and the extent to which it relates to what the problem has been described here. General Hyten came to us last year. Secretary Ross, Administrator Bridenstine testified about the nature of the space debris problem and its urgency. Part of the logic for us was that General Hyten thought that it was proper that because we were going to be interacting with a whole range of commercial actors in space, that it was logical for the Commerce Department to actually take on that responsibility. So let's talk about what we've done since that time.
So the FAA obviously deals with a lot of commercial actors in the air as well. So.
Absolutely, Senator. What we have done since that time, though, when people say, why Commerce, I would give a couple of answers. Number one, we have technical organizations like NOAA, the organization that I sit in, as well as NIST, very much self-interested. There's a group at NOAA that pays very careful attention to the space debris impact on NOAA weather satellites and others, as well as NIST. Secretary Ross would talk about the fact that we for 40% of the data that the U.S. government shares with the American people actually comes out of the Commerce Department. So a wide range of organizations internally actually have models for sharing information of the kind we'll need with the space debris problem. Most importantly, I talk about our interactions with the supply and demand aspects on space debris. On the supply side, we are routinely interacting with a wide range of new companies that are coming into the market. I mentioned this in my remarks. New sensors and a very diverse set of sensors, new analytic tools that will increase the accuracy of the data that's shared with operators, and new visualization platforms. That's the supply side. But we're also routinely interacting with the companies that will effectively change what information is required in space. So when we consider CubeSat constellations, mega constellations, they will need new kinds of information from an SSA perspective. So we're seeing both dimensions of that. And then obviously the open architecture data repository that we talked about, we're interacting with a wide range of industries. I'll call them adjacent industries, not necessarily space industries, artificial intelligence, cloud computing, that can greatly affect how this changes. And again, by all sense, it's got to change very quickly.
Well, thank you. One final question, Mr. O'Connell. The commercial space industry, as it's growing, there's also expanding interest in launch capabilities in other places around the country. In my home state, Michigan, for instance, the Michigan Launch Initiative is working to develop a spaceport for the potential launch of low-orbit polar satellites, and our geographic position is well-suited for that. The question is, what is the Department of Commerce doing to work with organizations like the Michigan Launch Initiative to develop private spaceports and increase our national capacity to support commercial space as a result of that?
So we're routinely asked to meet with spaceport leaders, organizations that relate to building new spaceports. One of the questions that the Secretary likes to ask is how many spaceports is the right number of spaceports in the country. That will absolutely relate, Senator, to the extent to which the vision that we've laid out for space, that the administration has laid out for space, comes true. The extent to which we can manage the airspace integration piece, that is very much an FAA, Department of Transportation responsibility, but the vision beyond that, that we can actually achieve. But we're more than happy to meet with everyone who is in the process of building a spaceport.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yes, Senator.
Thank you very much, Senator Peters. Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator and Mr. O'Connell, both of you spoke in your testimony about the need for the United States to be competitive in commercial space. Does NASA or the Department of Commerce have a definition or a standard by which they consider the United States to be competitive? In other words, what are some of the factors that each of you would view as being an indication that the United States is competitive?
I would start, Senator, with I think the question for me is, what nation on the planet is the preferred partner of choice? And right now, the United States of America is that preferred partner. We talk to our international partners, and they are keenly interested in partnering with us on a whole host of missions. And while they are willing to partner with other nations, they're generally more interested in us because we bring more capability, we are more open and transparent with the discoveries, and it gives them prestige in the world, in fact, to partner with the United States of America. So I think that's a key metric, but I think also just achievement in general. In the last year, we have landed InSight on Mars. We are the only nation on the planet that has ever landed a robot on another world, and we've now done it on Mars 8 times successfully. This time, when we landed InSight, we did it with international partners that brought technology to the table. So that's a very good thing. And then, of course, over the holiday, we had a flyby of Ultima Thule, which was the same spacecraft that flew, or it was with New Horizons, which is the same spacecraft that flew by Pluto back in 2014. We're talking about 4 billion miles from Earth, a mission that's been going on for years, and it's just delivering stunning images and science. And of course, now over the same holiday, we entered orbit around Bennu, which is an asteroid in deep space. and OSIRIS-REx, which is the robot, the satellite, if you will, that is currently in orbit around Bennu. It will be bringing samples home from that asteroid. Our capabilities as a nation are stunning. People want to partner with us. It is important for us to stay at the cutting edge of this. I will tell you.
What specifically do our industries do to provide for that? You know, as a government, we're not necessarily the ones that are achieving this. It's businesses, it's industries. What makes them so unique? What makes it the cutting edge?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. Number one, we have the best university system in the world, and when we want to do a mission to Ultima Thule, we've got OSIRIS-REx is run by the University of Arizona. We've got another mission that's coming up where we're going to go to an asteroid in the asteroid belt. It's not even an asteroid. It's a huge steel ball that might be the planet, the core of a planet that got destroyed, or maybe the core of a planet that's currently being developed. I don't know. Nobody else knows either. But that's a mission that's being run by Arizona State University. In Oklahoma, they're doing a mission called GeoCarb to study the Earth. So we have amazing scientists and engineers and technicians and students even that get involved because we have such an amazing university system. And then those universities partner with industry to help develop the technology and the capability. So
I'm going to
yes,
jump because I'm running out of time, and Mr. O'Connell, you can feel free to jump in here as well. When we look at programs like the Space Grant, the NASA Space Grant, that supports future scientists, future engineers, how is NASA ensuring its educational programs are going to support the future needs that we see in commercial space programs that are coming up? You have just a short period of time.
Yes, ma'am. So the key is Space Grant is a good program that NASA takes advantage of right now. And what we're looking towards doing is engaging students in our activities. So we partner with universities. We partner even now. I was just at an event where it was a robotics competition called First Robotics. Thousands of students there in high school that are building robots. This is the next generation of the engineers, the technicians that will build our robots that go to Mars and onto other destinations. So we are keenly aware of developing that talent and the necessity to develop that talent, and we're committed to it.
May I just make a brief comment? I would echo everything that Administrator Bridenstine said. We have been talking a lot about the trillion-dollar space economy and what the building blocks are to get there. Part of it is continuing innovation in things that are already commercialized space while other capabilities come to market. I mentioned the role of the private sector and private capital, very important. But even inside the Commerce Department, we actually have two grant-making organizations, the Economic Development Administration and the Minority Business Development Agency, which just celebrated its 50th anniversary. Both of those organizations have space commerce grants. And in fact, the first space commerce grant out of MBDA is actually a grant to travel around the country and attract traditional and new entrepreneurs to the space business. People, in short, Senator, are still very excited about going to space.
Okay. Thank you both very much.
Thank you, Senator Fisher. Senator Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. I want to thank the witnesses for your leadership on this important issue. What I want to actually talk to both of you about is an issue that you haven't really raised that much, but it's the power of inspiration for the next generation of Americans with regard to all that NASA and others are doing with regard to space exploration. Now, I've asked this before in other hearings relating to space exploration, but since I have you here, Administrator, have you seen the movie The Martian?
I have.
Okay. How about First Man? I saw that just the other day on my.
I have.
And so, how about you, Mr. O'Connor? So, here's my question. These are great movies, and I don't normally plug Hollywood, but I think these are really inspirational. And I have 3 daughters, and they've seen them, and they love these movies because they inspire us, right? And what they do is they inspire us with particularly young people who can do great things. You talked about the universities in America. I actually agree that that's a huge strategic advantage. But what is NASA doing to kind of bring that can-do, inspirational culture, but also inspiration to the next generation of Americans. It's not just the scientists, but it's also the, like the movie The Right Stuff. There's courage, there's adventure, there's sacrifice. The First Man, that movie highlights that. What are you doing to help us regenerate that as a country? Because I think we can do it better than anyone else. But there's an intangible that relates to NASA, and space exploration is so much more important than competing with the Chinese or commercial technology. It's really the inspiration of a nation and the next generation of Americans. And you guys can do that. I think NASA's, to be honest, has lost that a little bit. But I think you can redo it. Hollywood's being helpful in this regard with some of their movies. But can you talk to that issue? Because I think it's probably one of the most important things you can do for our nation.
Yes, Senator. So I would argue that the key thing we need to do as a nation is do stunning things. We need to do things that capture the imagination of the American public and, in fact, capture the imagination of the world. I tell people frequently, I wasn't around during Apollo 11. We're celebrating the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11. I wasn't there.
You weren't born?
I was not yet born.
All right.
But I will tell you this. I remember exactly where I was in 5th grade, Miss Powers' English class, when the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded. I remember her walking into the room. I remember tears coming down her face. I remember the students being like, "What's wrong with Mrs. Powers?" I remember her gathering up all of the other teachers and bringing in the TVs and turning them on. Those are the moments that are emblazoned in the memories of my generation. We need to change that.
Yeah.
We need to have those moments where this generation sees people walking on the moon. This generation sees people making the advancements necessary to get to Mars. And in fact, this generation could see people walking on Mars.
Let me give you just a quick example. We have a program in Alaska called ANSEP, which is an Alaska Native engineering program for young high school kids going into college, and then they could do it into college. I was at their annual dinner the other night, and we had an astronaut speaking at the dinner back in Anchorage. It was very, very inspirational. One of the young kids came up to me, and he had been hired recently by NASA to work on the rocket that's going to go to Mars.
Nice.
And I mean, it was just incredible. This inspiration of this young kid who worked really hard. You got to earn it, right? But we want to be able to help you do this in a way that I think changes the culture. As you mentioned, the idea of the Challenger exploding, which was a horrible tragedy, is not the image we want. It's Neil Armstrong.
That's
right. And I think it's your greatest asset. We want to be able to help you with that, but we really do need to inspire the next generation of Americans. Mr. O'Connell, do you have any thoughts on how Congress can help you with that, or what you can do? I think partnering with the media, like I said, Hollywood, on some really, really good movies lately, just to bring that inspiration is something that we should look at taking advantage of. What do you think?
Absolutely, Senator, and I would not underestimate the power of private enterprise here, where you can do cool things and also make money in the process. There's sometimes this view that science and commerce are incongruous.
So I'm assuming you're kind of endorsing capitalism. No, that's a whole other.
Indeed, I am. I am from the commerce.
We're debating that now, believe it or not. But I endorse capitalism as well. But as part of exploring the cosmos, you think that's a powerful thing that NASA can be doing for this generation of Americans?
Not just NASA, but also at Commerce. Yep. We're talking to a number of universities around the country who want to develop a space commerce curriculum in the business schools, for example. So we have our own role in the education area as well. I've mentioned the MBDA grant, and again, their Space Foundation under that grant is actually traveling around the country to attract not just the traditional entrepreneurs to the business, but people of other walks of life who are interested in space, may not have the technical skills, but saying, boy, I'm interested, maybe there's something I can do here. So we want to attract a wider audience. What I like to say sometimes is that we'll never get to the trillion-dollar space economy if space is left only in the heads of the technical people. We need a much wider community of people to participate in that. Sorry.
I know we're over time, but I'd like to make two quick points that are critical here. Because Kevin is working on the commercial stuff. We are helping with commercial stuff as well. We just saw a commercial vehicle, the Dragon, docked to the International Space Station. Everybody in the world saw that. I was on the phone yesterday with our international partners. They're all congratulating me. They're thrilled about it. It's going to drive down cost, increase access, enable us to go to the International Space Station with more capability, more people to do more experiments, and drive down costs. So all of that's very positive. So that's a good thing. The other thing is when we landed InSight on Mars, an important point here, we were on the cover of every newspaper worldwide. Children in Tehran were basically reading good stories about the United States of America landing on Mars. That's the kind of influence that NASA brings to the table, the inspiration, the idea that we can reshape or transform the image of the United States for people all around the world. When we talk about the instruments of national power, diplomatic, information, military, economic, that information piece is what NASA brings to the table. And by the way, that's our history and tradition going back to Apollo 8 and Apollo 11. The whole world sees our stunning achievements, and it inspires everybody.
Great. Thank you very much. We want to help you with that mission, too.
Senator Sullivan endorses capitalism and Hollywood. Senator Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank both of you for being here today. And I appreciate what you're doing and certainly have learned a lot. Europe, China, and Russia are all developing a wide array of space-based robotics and satellite systems. We haven't really gotten into this discussion on the question, but Mr. Administrator, we've talked about this before. I believe it's vital that we develop the technology to repair, refuel, and refurbish those satellites and systems so that we can enhance their capability and their lifetime, their operational lifetime. You've talked about space debris. I think this leads into that. In the West Virginia Robotic Technology Center, our state is making a significant contribution to ensure that the U.S. does not fall behind our global competition in an area that is critical to science, commerce, and our national security on the repair, refurbish, and refueling of our existing satellites. Could both of you talk about what you're doing in NASA and then also at the Department of Commerce to ensure that we're leading the way in this, and give us an update on where you see this going?
So right now NASA is developing Restore-L, which is a mission that is going to basically refuel a Landsat satellite operated by USGS, which is it's a great mission for NASA. Robotic servicing of satellites is a capability and a technology that I think will have an effect that drives down cost. Satellites are extremely expensive, and if we can extend their life, use them longer, it drives down costs and increases our ability to do things. So I think robotics is a key piece of that. I think as we move forward, what we have to be focused on are technologies, going to the commercial piece, technologies that can be commercialized. NASA does not want to operate a fleet of satellites running around the globe servicing, whether it's doing maintenance or refueling satellites. What we want to do is develop the technologies, develop the capabilities, license or transfer those technologies to commercial industry and let them operate fleets so that NASA can continue doing the things that NASA is good at, which robotics is one of those things. So we're happy to be a partner in this effort.
Thank you.
Senator, thank you for the question. The satellite servicing and the robotics industries are critical to changing, as the Administrator said, the entire economics of space. And so we're routinely talking to this. I think your question, though, pushes me toward the question of how we're going to regulate companies that come forward in the market. We're pretty familiar with how to regulate remote sensing, communications, navigation companies. I'm very interested in how we're going to take on new companies that come forward with brand new capabilities that we have no experience with before. When I talked about this in my remarks, the need for, if you will, regulatory efficiency, especially given that other countries around the world already have lighter regulatory regimes and are trying to attract new talent, new companies to their spaces as well. So it's very important that we pay attention to those capabilities early as they come forward in the market.
Well, that leads me to my next question. I know West Virginia University has been participating with NASA on these issues. And I'm so glad somebody brought up the university partnerships that you both have, because I think that's critical, not just for the next generation. It's an economic driver for many states. Mine certainly is one of those. I'm wondering, do you have any Are there any roadblocks, or have you experienced any difficulties in forming these partnerships with universities? Is there something that we can do to increase those capabilities?
NASA has really amazing partnerships with a lot of universities. I don't know of anything offhand that would prohibit us doing that more. But I think one of the areas as it relates to robotics, when we talk about the regulatory regime, we hear in international fora about the requirement under the Outer Space Treaty to provide authorization and continuing supervision for activities that are non-traditional and activities in general. But when it comes to robotic servicing of satellites, some countries around the world see that as very provocative. And so creating a regulatory regime, which we're doing now for the first time, where we can provide that authorization and continuing supervision for those robotics activities, and ultimately give confidence to international partners and even international competitors that this is not being something that is being utilized for any kind of hostile purposes. That's I think, a key component for the robotics that I know the Commerce Department right now is moving out on under the direction of Space Policy Directive 2 from the President.
That's correct.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you very much, Senator Capito. Senator Moran.
Chairman, thank you. Thank you both for being here, Mr. McConnell and Administrator. To follow up on the conversation you were just having with the Senator from West Virginia, Senator Warner and I, the Senator from Virginia and I, are working on reintroducing our Aeronautics Innovation Act designed to boost the attention and resources, and it really is hoping to provide a guide to NASA's Aeronautics Research Mission Directive. And I'm happy to have you, I think maybe you answered the question when Senator Capito asked about what's the impediments, what can be done to make some changes. But we're working to make certain that the congressional support for research in aeronautics is enhanced, not diminished. And we look forward to working with you in that regard. Administrator Bridenstine, I'm mostly here to tell you thank you for your visit to Kansas and to highlight something for you. We'll have additional conversations about the importance of STEM education when we have a budget conversation, appropriations conversation. But I wanted you to know that just a few weeks ago in my office was a student who participated in our STEM event in Wichita, at which you spoke and an astronaut spoke, and we rekindled his boyhood dream of going to Mars. And he now has decided that this is the career that he wants to pursue. And I just point out that those efforts at NASA, your efforts in particular in Wichita, but you and an astronaut have such a capability of changing a person's life. I'm of the view we change the world one person at a time. And I want you to know that we want to make certain that NASA remains that agency that inspires another generation. And highlighting just one student who was affected by what you had to say, I wanted you to be aware of that.
Well, Senator, thank you for saying that. And NASA has a long history and tradition of this. We have employees that visit all kinds of museums and institutions, as we visited, to do just that. And that's ultimately how we create that next generation of scientist, technician, engineer, mathematician, and I'm proud to do that. I would also say that trip to Wichita was transformative for me, understanding and seeing for the first time what a digital twin is of an aircraft. And now, NASA is actually, we have commercial partners that are using digital twins of spacecraft. In other words, we can stress the digital twin in a computer model just as the spacecraft itself has been stressed in space. And the reason we do that is so we can make assessments as to the health of the spacecraft and how long it's going to last and whether or not we should fly it again, those kind of things. And so I will tell you, I enjoyed the trip very much. I learned a lot, and it has applicability that goes beyond aviation and into aero, and I think or into space. I think that is why when we think about NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, first day in NASA is aeronautics. it is directly applicable to what we do in space.
I've tried to explain dual twin to many people here in my legislative role, and I may just start quoting you, Administrator. Thank you. I'm shuffling this morning between defense appropriations and here. The Air Force is in front of our committee today, and the tremendous challenges we face in space and the defense of our country. We need to make certain that we're doing everything in the defense and the civil side of aerospace and space for purposes of the safety of our country. And the common denominator there is attracting a workforce with talent, skill, and intellect, and you play a significant role in that regard. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Senator Moran. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And what a pleasure it is to see you in this role, Mr. Bridenstine. And
yes, ma'am. What a pleasure it is to see you in that role.
I appreciate that. For those that don't know, when he was a freshman member of the House, he was on the hallway where I had my office. We had a lot of freshmen there, and it was like I was the chief mama in charge of helping with all these freshmen. You're doing such a great job, and I think last week's success was indicative of the energy that you're bringing, so we appreciate that. Mr. O'Connell, I've got a question for you specifically. As you look at commerce and space and consider commercialization and kind of a new frontier, let's talk about spectrum. It is valuable, and I want to hear from you what you think commerce is doing right and what they could be doing to make certain that we do not waste any of this spectrum.
Thank you, Senator, for the question. Indeed, spectrum is one of the critical dependencies for both space as well as the administration's 5G strategy. And so some of the debates have been intense. They're deeply technical. And what we have been concerned about with regard specifically to the space industry is making sure that we're bringing the proper data into the discussion relating to economic value of either technical decisions or future applications. Our worry on the space side, of course, has been that the taxpayer has invested billions of dollars in capabilities related to either world-class weather prediction, everyone's ability to navigate leaving this hearing via GPS, and Administrator Bridenstine's capability to beam back from billions of miles away with fascinating scientific experiments. And so we're really trying to make sure that the space community is well advocated for as part of an overall administration strategy on 5G.
And I would add into that, you're probably looking at drones and the commercial utilization of drones.
Absolutely. They're both drones, and then there's a whole new class of activity.
Of satellites.
Underneath satellites, there's something that are called high-altitude platforms.
Correct.
So there's a lot of things in that vertical spectrum that have to be considered when we think about spectrum.
And it needs to be done in an orderly process.
Yes, ma'am. Absolutely.
And we will look forward to you all coming back to us with some recommendations on that. You know, as we work on the 5G issue, I continue to remind people this is going to be as transformative as when we went from analog to digital.
Yes, ma'am, absolutely.
And I think that our hopes are very high for what this is going to do, but we've got to be mindful of how we use and slice and pack that spectrum and not have any of it going to waste, laying fallow.
And under Space Policy Directive 2, obviously, there's a report that's coming due immediately that you'll be made aware of on how we think about the space component of that.
Right, absolutely. One question for you, Mr. Bridenstine. The public-private partnerships are going to end up being more important, certainly for each of you, but I think for NASA, as you kind of give it a new footing, if you will, and kind of help it find priorities. So I wish you would talk for just a moment about what we could do to help you in that realm as we expand these public-private partnerships and as you reprioritize the activity of the agency and reshape that agency.
Yes, ma'am. So as you're aware, what we're trying to do where there are commercial marketplaces is we want to be a customer rather than the owner and operator of hardware, which of course is very expensive. So if we become one customer of many customers, costs go down. At the same time, we don't want to get in a position where we are a customer and we have a single provider of services, because then we're going from having a government monopoly to a commercial monopoly, which isn't the right approach either. So we need a marketplace where we're a customer, there are other customers, but also have numerous providers. And those providers compete on cost and innovation to do things that are very similar to what they would do commercially. So when it comes to low Earth orbit, we are on the International Space Station right now with commercial crew capability, almost. We've demonstrated at least a test flight at this point. But we've been doing commercial resupply to the International Space Station for a number of years. This capability has driven down costs, it increases access, and ultimately it will enable us to have, basically one customer of many customers. The engineering costs get spread across numerous different partners. What we'd like to do, Senator, as we move forward, is replicate that model for commercial habitation in low Earth orbit. So we talk right now about the International Space Station, critical capability for the United States of America. Using the space station in order to test commercial habitats, we could create an entire commercial, I guess, domain of space exploration in low Earth orbit where NASA is a customer. Then we can use the very precious resources that you give us to go to the moon, where there's not yet a commercial marketplace. But there could be a commercial marketplace, given the resources available at the moon, namely the water ice that we discovered back in 2008. So when we think about this, we're looking at building this architecture, a new paradigm where we have commercial and international partners side by side with NASA, accomplishing new things that nobody could do on their own, but collectively we can all do more. So authorities to do that kind of activity would be very helpful. And I'm looking forward to working with you on that as days go by.
Excellent. We look forward to it also. And I will say user fees, funding needed research. That's always a good platform that works.
Okay.
I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blackburn. Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much. Welcome to both of you. You know what a leader the U.S. has been when it comes to space, and as you also know, we're facing competition from other nations. China has planned to construct its own space station in low Earth orbit, the China Space Station, or CSS, and the CSS may launch as soon as this year, and China has already begun inviting other countries to apply to conduct experiments aboard it. The European Space Agency is reportedly working with China. How are NASA and the Office of Space Commerce planning to ensure that the U.S. remains competitive in space explorations?
Senator, we continue to move out doing stunning achievements, going to the International Space Station where we have our international partners already on board. And as we go to the next step, which is to the moon, this time when we go to the moon to actually stay, and that means using our international partners, having them join us in our effort to go to the moon, keeps them in our sphere, which I think is important. I can tell you right now, as the head of the agency, I meet with our international partners regularly, and they are very excited about going to the moon with us, which has never been done before, where we go to the moon with international partners. So I think that's a critical capability to achieve. So there are, I think, good stories to tell right now, but you are right.
Okay. Mr. O'Connell, along these same lines, in your testimony you highlight the need for strong protections of U.S. intellectual property rights for cutting-edge space technology. A recent study found that China is using foreign investment as a means to transfer technology assessed at approximately $300 billion a year. It's a clear threat to our U.S. intellectual rights protections. What's your agency doing to address this issue?
So may I respond first, Senator, to your first question? We're in our advocacy work, we're actually trying to understand the value of the ecosystem that will support the space exploration that NASA has. In December, we held a space investment summit where Secretary Ross was essentially asking what's the longer-term investment climate for the space industry from even beyond where it is now. Just last week, we held a space insurance summit, which is—
And what do you think are the main barriers to growth for the commercial space sector?
I spoke in my remarks about regulatory efficiency, the extent to which companies need to come to different places when they come to town for licensing. We have an idea, a vision for something we call a one-stop shop, where companies come to one place at the office, ideally a bureau at some point, where they can come to one place. We have detailees from other agencies that can actually provide authority on those issues.
All right. Do you want to quick do the intellectual property? Because I have one more question.
Absolutely. So we're relying heavily on NIST, another component organization in the cybersecurity framework, and some of the things that they're doing in broad cyber terms to apply that to space as well, giving companies notice of some of the challenges that we're seeing in the market, as well as listening to what they're seeing in the market when their systems are threatened or vulnerable.
Very good. I worked with Senator Heller on the Inspiring the Next Space Pioneers, Innovators, Researchers, and Explorers Act. That was our bill to authorize NASA to encourage women to study in STEM fields, and also a different one we did together to make sure women researchers can get their ideas into the commercial world. Both bills were signed by the President in 2017. Administrator Bridenstine, can you provide an update on NASA's efforts? I know we've talked about public-private partnerships, but how about efforts to increase the recruitment and retention of women and minorities, something that's so important, not just at NASA, but in science as a whole?
Yes, ma'am. So NASA is very focused on this. It doesn't take long to walk around the NASA headquarters in those areas that you mentioned and recognize that women are underrepresented.
I think it's like women are about half the workforce, but about 25% at NASA.
Yes, ma'am, that's probably right. And in some,
as we've learned from Hidden Figures. But
okay.
Anyway.
And in some fields, it might even be less than 25%.
Okay.
So
it's 25% of STEM workers is what they are.
Okay.
But NASA probably has even less, but yes, keep going.
We are making great advancement in the science fields at NASA. We've had statistically significant improvements in recruiting and retaining women in these fields. When it comes to the engineering, we're not where we need to be. We continue to make progress. Some of the things that we do and we're doing every day, we have, American astronauts that are female, and we're making sure that they're getting out in the public and doing engagement with young ladies. At the same time, this month, this is a great story, we have the first all-female spacewalk. So we're going to have 2 women leave the International Space Station and do critical work on the outside of the International Space Station.
And how about the minority front?
Yes, ma'am. So the same challenges apply there, and we are working diligently to increase their representation as well through the same mechanisms. But I think the big thing that we can do is continue to do these stunning achievements, because that inspires everybody and gets everybody more activated.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
Yes,
appreciate it.
Mr. Bridenstine, on the engineering, the universities could help you there too.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Senator Gardner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Administrator, for being here. Mr. O'Connell, thank you very much for the testimony today. Thank you as well for your recent visit to Colorado, and the Deputy Administrator as well. We celebrated the 70th anniversary of the LASP Space Physics Laboratory in Boulder, University of Colorado. Great partnership between NASA. Colorado receives more NASA funding, I think, than any other state in the country, and the work that we do. We'd love to talk to you about a NASA Center, perhaps, in Colorado, and the opportunities we have to continue engaging Colorado in the aerospace and space